Hello and welcome to another Simcoe Muskoka Workforce Development Board Workforce webisode. I'm Rob Shepard, Project Facilitator at the board, and I'm joined today by data analyst Tom Zissis. Hi, Tom.
Hey, Rob.
If you're an employer, you no doubt have found it increasingly difficult to fill entry-level positions over the last few years. Many employers have voiced opinions like it's not like it used to be in terms of having primarily youth and young adults applying in large numbers for entry-level positions. SMWDB engaged Tom to study the trends, key indicators, and pressures on young job seekers over the last 4 decades that might explain why this is the case. In the process, he discovered some very compelling demographic and economic evidence. Tom, could you start with some of your key findings?
There are quite a number of statistics we looked at, and to begin with, I guess the most obvious one is that there are just fewer youth. We had a demographic bulge of youth because of the baby boom generation, which declined substantially. So if you go back to, say, 1981, 15 to 19-year-olds were around 12% of the Ontario population. And by 2016, they were slightly less than 8%. So that's a significant drop. So there were fewer youth in the population, which also meant there were fewer youth in the labor force. But the other thing that was happening was youth were staying in school longer because we started having changes in our economy where post-secondary education was becoming more important in terms of accessing good jobs. And so youth stayed in school longer. So when you're in school, you're less likely to work. And that's not to say that you're not working, but being in school means your participation rate is lower. But then even for those who are in school, you had a smaller proportion of them were working while they were attending school. So at every single level, you just had a decline in the numbers that were available, particularly for these entry-level jobs.
Does this mean that youth, especially those with higher levels of education, are not working in entry-level jobs so much?
So one of the things I want to share with you is this slide that, first of all, shows this increasing level of post-secondary education. So this shows both for females and males. And I mentioned females first because they typically stay in school more so than males do. So looking back from in 1991, 27% of females aged 20 to 24 had a post-secondary education. By that, we mean it could be university, it could be college, or it could be an apprenticeship. Whereas for males, it was 18%. And you can see the substantial increase in those percentages once we get to 2016. This is for Ontario. The figures for Simcoe and Muskoka, it's the same trend, just that the levels of education were slightly lower, and particularly for males. So first of all, yes, there's the evidence in terms of their levels of education. What is surprising is that in terms of their share of the labor force, the concentration of youth in entry-level jobs actually more or less stayed the same, and it's depending on the age group and the gender, it actually increased over that time. So even though youth were gaining these higher levels of education, it wasn't being reflected in the jobs they were attaining. That's not to say that in their later years as adults, they weren't doing better in terms of their outcomes. Certainly the proportion of jobs that required post-secondary education increased. But I'm just saying for youth, for 15 to 24-year-olds, their higher levels of education did not result in better labor market outcomes in terms of the education level of the job they were in.
Another part of this study looked at wages and the living costs that youth have experienced over this time frame. What can you tell us about that?
So I suppose it actually came as a bit of a surprise, maybe once you think about it, when you think of what the experience has been over the last couple of decades, it made sense. But the surprise was that when you held for inflation, that the average employment income for youth actually declined from 1981 to the present time. This chart compares males and females, as well as those 15 to 24 and I'm sorry, 20 to 24-year-olds, and those who are 25 years and older. So that double blue line, the line at the top, those are males aged 25 and over. You can see the average income's been increasing. The next line, the double red line, are females 25 years and over. Their incomes have also been increasing and slightly narrowing the gap with males. But then the next two lines, those are 20 to 24-year-olds. So these are people who are working full-time, full year. So we're taking out the part-time workers, and amazingly, their wages, average income, employment income dropped during that period. It dropped substantially through 1991 to 2006, and then it slightly increased again, but never reached the levels that were originally at in 1981. Meanwhile, as we know, prices are always going up. And when we in the study we look at a whole bunch of categories of expenses and show the percentage increases in those costs. So wages dropping and everything else going up. One way we wanted to illustrate that is on this next chart. We're showing how many hours working at minimum wage it took to pay for the average tuition. The blue line is the average tuition in Ontario. And again, we go back to 1980, and you can see the figure on the chart. It shows that around 277 hours were needed working at minimum wage to pay for that tuition. Well, then that figure starts increasing and increasing. Partly had to do with how universities were being funded. It got to the stage where it more than doubled, it almost tripled. Youth were having to work 747 hours to pay for that tuition. Now that figure dropped in the last couple of years, but not because tuition dropped, but because we increased the level of the minimum wage. The orange line there shows the figures for Georgian College, and so those tuition costs were lower. The increase was not as great, but it still is there, you can see, and also a slight decline in the last couple of years because of that change in the minimum wage level.
Are there any lessons that we can draw from these findings, especially regarding this shortage of entry-level workers?
Well, from an employer's perspective, the obvious answer, I guess, is higher wages are going to attract more job candidates. Now, that's not an easy proposition to suggest to employers, especially at this moment in the post-pandemic period. Everyone's really strapped for cash. But I think, the things employers might consider is the value of job retention. Like, how do you hold on to a worker once you have them? If you've got seasonal workers, how do you ensure that they come back the following year? Because there's a lot of costs involved in having to recruit and then retrain individuals. So and those individuals, when they come back the following year, they've already got the skills. So there might be some value then in that instance, because they're more productive. You don't have to spend time transitioning them to raise their wages slightly. You might provide more opportunities to learn other skills, to take on other functions within the job place, so that they have a sense of responsibility and a sense of personal growth. So I think there's things you can do from a human resources point of view, apart from simply having a higher wage to attract workers, is to focus on holding on to workers so you don't have the same turnover cost.
Thank you, Tom. This is excellent information. We think this will be an excellent report for employers in our service area. The link to the complete study is available on our website, smwdb.com. And I want to thank you for joining us for another SMWDB Workforce webisode.